alliances was definitely a major problem of his.
It's kind of telling that he was an artillery captain, right? First.
Yeah. That's how he was trained.
I mean, like, that's all just like blow stuff up with your cannons. And he kind of had that explosive attitude when it comes to the battle.
Right? It's weird that he mellowed out later on in the campaign. It might have been partially because of the Russian campaign.
Maybe. So I wasn't sure, but apparently calling him Napoleon the Great was really controversial in many parts of Europe.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Because, I mean, although Europe is the way it is today because of him, he still did quite a few things that are pretty far out there.
Oh, yeah. Pretty crazy stuff. Where he created forerunners to what would become.
Better than it was because it had competition.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. It is a little controversial whether to call him the Great or not.
Napoleon the Great?
Yeah.
Call him the Great, dude. He brought freedom to the world. Well, basically.
I don't know about that. He was just as autocratic.
He's pretty ruthless.
No, him himself, but
He tried.
A lot of what he did was he codified.
French and Roman law.
Yeah.
And ever since then, it was about meritocracy.
Which is good because he took the best parts of the French Revolution. Yeah, and then just
He
spread
himself
it.
was a tyrant, but a lot of what he tried to do was actually, and a lot of what ended up happening was very good towards promoting the Enlightenment ideals.
Are we rolling? By the way?
Well, I'm gonna start it at some point.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
Because I can always start it whenever I need to.
Yeah, this is good.
But-
Cool. So you called him a tyrant. Would you go as far as to say he was despotic in his way?
Like arbitrarily, yeah, definitely despotic.
Okay.
But he wasn't.
Self-crowned emperor.
He was just. He could. Here's how I would put it. He could be despotic. Like that was in his playbook. But a lot of times he was actually the emperor that wanted to bring order and stability, and he wasn't out for blood. Like there was a famous part where there was a conspiracy where one of the kings, the late kings, his nephew or his cousin or someone real close to the throne was seen as a threat, and he wanted to massacre him. They captured him, killed him, but he let the people decide whether he should die or not.
Right.
Like a despotic person just off with everyone's head. Napoleon tried to appear very democratic. He tried, but I would still say he's despotic because at the end of the day, it came to what he wanted to do.
Right.
I would say that even though I would agree that he's despotic, the question is what kind of despotic? Because at that time, depending on the monarch, they tried to be very enlightened.
Yeah.
Probably the best form of a monarchy of the time was probably the closest thing to the best monarchy system that could possibly exist. Or it was the last time monarchism was still a massive thing in the world.
All right, so let's go. After this crowd goes through the countdown, 3, and then we'll start. Nick, do you want to go ahead and start with his birth after we make it real quick? Just talk about his birth and then how he rose to power. How quick can you do the whole thing?
I can do it relatively quickly.
3 minutes?
Well, let me ask you this: where do you want me to stop? That's the real question.
Stop when he's the second time he's exiled.
Damn, that's
That's
all of
quite
it.
a bit.
That's all of it.
That's quite a bit.
Stop when he sees his military power in the coup.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So piece it up.
Alrighty then. It's
Alright.
probably going to be around that time that I'm going to start asking you guys to take over, because that somewhere around there I'm going to need you guys to start jumping in. Otherwise, I'm going to start rambling. Okay.
All right. So
3, 2, 1.
All
Hello.
Wow, well, let me go ahead and throw this off.
Nice.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is another video of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society, and we have a special program for you today because we're going to be talking about none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. Yep, he's one of the greatest generals of all time, one of the first people to try to bring liberty and freedom to Europe. He was really reformed the way that the military system is ever since. Even today, our military system has a lot that is derived from him. He brought the modern law codes to Europe. He did a lot of things. He's a great man, but he has a lot of flaws. And that's what makes him great for the Wisdom Factory discussion here, because we're not just trying to give you a history lesson, because you can do that. You can look on any YouTube video, read Wikipedia. Go ahead and go do that if you're looking for that. But right here is just going to be a general discussion amongst 3 philosophers, amongst 3 scholars, about what can we learn from the life of Napoleon and his rise to power and the fall of the empire that he built. So the first thing that we should do is go ahead and, well, let's introduce Rob and Nick, and I have Jordan. And Nick's going to go ahead and give you guys a brief preview of up until
he starts taking
seizes
power.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to try to make this pretty quickly. I'm trying to make this quick. But anyway, Napoleon was born of minor Corsican nobility, mind you. So he wasn't exactly French to begin with. And his father also won a Corsican heritage. And at that time, Corsica had just been taken over by the French, just only a few years prior. And when Napoleon was growing up, he grew to hate his father. He saw his father as a traitor to the local Italian nobility of the area, even though he was of minor nobility. Even though I say minor nobility, he was poor at that time. But he hated everything that was French. He started deciding that, you know what, in order to do more for the island and to maybe spat more at the French, I'm going to go to their military academy and learn. He wasn't able to go into the infantry, so he decided to go into the artillery. And he stayed there as a very good leader of an artillery corps. And then the revolution kicked in the 1780s, roughly right after the American Revolutionary War. As this time progressed, people like Jacques Rousseau started turning the country into a crap hole. It did not end well.
You're talking about the Reign of Terror?
I'm talking about the Reign of Terror.
That was more Voltaire.
You're right, it was more Voltaire, but Rousseau still had an influence of it, regardless. But yeah, after and the reason, Montesquieu, major French figures, and strange enough, when this terror began, even before the Reign of Terror began, the public started getting angry with the French with the French monarchy because they raised taxes, they didn't do anything for the French people, and they found it also hypocritical for the French monarchy to support basically a people's revolt back in the States against the British. So they kind of found that as hypocritical and started adopting some of the same principles that the American founding fathers had, and then tried to apply it to France.
Yeah, one of the key figures in that era that I just love as an American, if you read the story, is Lafayette.
He was a noble.
Yeah, Lafayette gave his fortune, like a lot of money that he had, he put towards the American cause, and he never really got his money back. And he was instrumental in the Battle of Yorktown. He was an understudy of Washington, and he truly loved America. If you read the letters that he wrote, he looked at Washington as a father. In fact, he named his son Washington, George Washington. So he was an American by
spirit, by heart.
Spirit, yeah. But he was also French, and when he was living in America and he saw how we were doing things and how we had kind of did away with the huge inequality that existed.
The three estates.
And where in America it was about the merit, it was about reasonable things, it was about people coming together and talking about things and fighting for principles other than just fighting for a state power, which they had. And he was venerated when he came back. He was like a hero.
Oh yeah, he was seen as a national hero.
Yeah, a national hero. Non-stop parties, non-stop balls in his honor. And I'm sure naturally people ask, well, why is this guy so venerated? Why is he so respected? And he went ahead and he was espousing all of these principles, liberty, and they had a practical example of how beautiful these things could be, because he had stories on all kinds of people in different walks of life that made it, that had rose up, that had lived the early American dream. And you could just imagine, if you're a French person, getting the bits of that, hearing these things in the newspaper, you're like, that's something that resonates with me.
Oddly enough, Lafayette, to the French people at least, he symbolized what the enlightened despotism was, enlightened monarchism, where the nobles and the king were enlightened and that they were going to do what's good for the populace. That was in theory, but the French monarchy, on the other hand, was not like that. They were absolute monarchists, and whatever they said went.
Ruled by divine right. And
the divine right of kings. And they never got rid of that. And part of the reason why the people got extremely angry was that when the monarchy was still around, not only the nobles had power, but also the clergy. The clergy was still powerful in France, although independent from Rome. And it was separate. The society was separated into three estates: the first, second, and third. And the third was the people, the merchants. And they grew dissatisfied because they thought that their voice was not being heard, and they decided to revolt in response to that.
Yeah, so I think that's a good place to stop and talk about, because it does fit in so well with the story, the French Revolution. So to me, it tried to embody the Enlightenment ideals. I think they really did, where you talked about people having an inherent autonomy. People should decide for themselves how they should live. A tabula rasa, like a blank slate. What your destiny is determined by how hard you work and by, how educated you try to become and how smart and how skilled you try to become. Not simply you're born to be this way.
It at least argued that there was a possibility that you could be more than just a peasant, and that your kids and your grandkids will not just be peasants. They could be a merchant, or they could be living on the high seas. Basically something of a dream to them.
And to me, it's like the Enlightenment preceded it, because a lot of times in history, you'll see that the philosophy comes first, and then comes the implementation. And that's
the intellectuals.
That's what was happening. And so you had all kinds of new systems devised, how men should be governed, how men should relate to each other in law, how even like in military reforms were being groundbreaking military procedures were being uncovered, but because of the old system, they couldn't never implement it. Because you had, an 8-year-old aristocrat who could buy his way into the army, whereas, the military, great minds at the time were like, we should really reform this, but they really didn't have the opportunity. So you have this bubbling of ideas, the bubbling of the way things should be, and all of that sort of culminated into this French Revolution when they were like, let's take over.
Yeah, and Napoleon kind of came in at the perfect time, because with all that going on, he decided, well, we could just skip the whole, bureaucratic process, and being a man of action himself, he seized power and declared himself the military leader of France.
Yep. Ooh, I almost forgot, now that you mentioned about the hierarchy of the time. When the monarchy was still in power, the hierarchy, it went like this: that the nobles, they were going to have the officer and the general positions, or other high-ranking ones. It didn't matter whether you were one of intelligence and wisdom or stupid. It didn't matter. As long as you were noble, you could get that title. Or you were very powerful in the clergy, but I mean, how often would the clergy wouldn't have to move into that position anyway? And then for the people, they were always going to be soldiers, maybe captains of their squads. It was very, very rare for them to be anything higher than that. So the people also found that as weird and wrong to do that, because what's the point of going through all of this?
But you kind of can't blame it, because society had been like that since the beginning.
How do you overturn like hundreds of years?
Even thousands. The closest you get to a same type of meritocratic system is like in Rome, like in the not even like
you could say Charlemagne,
the Marian reforms up until the early Caesar, but after that it even gets into more hands of the nobles. But it's really it's always been, you have to have been born, your family has to have been done something. They have to have proof that you descend from a line that has accomplished great things. And now it's like none of that matters, right? Your parent could be a peasant, a serf, and you could go on to do great things. But let me ask you guys, the tactics, because I believe in what the French Revolution stood for, right? Equality, liberty, fraternity, and these type of things. But what really bothered you about the way that they went about accomplishing their goals and accomplishing these aims?
Too greedy. They were too greedy. And also, like what Rob said earlier, they were used to a system where there was always a strong man for such a long time. They didn't know what it was like, or at least a lot of them did not know what it was like to live on their own or do things of their own choices, even though they wanted it. So in essence, they were just not prepared for it, and they tried to jump into it, which is very problematic.
So there was going to be no slow process in overturning that thousands of years of history of that kind of system being ruled. the only solution was revolution, really, and quick overturning of the aristocrats, and then seizing power, and then, of course, the natural response to that would be military gain and strengthening the French power in Europe,
Purging opposition and
nationalism.
all of that.
Yeah.
I can understand.
So I don't
that.
really think it bothered me.
The reign of
Tons of
terror,
people died.
the
Tons
reign
of people
terror,
died. Yes.
I heard stories, right? Like, and you know what? We get graphic on the show. Last time I got graphic when we were talking about Alexander the Great. But like when you read about the French Revolution, it just really pinpoints you to how ugly society can be, and how, as bad as the French kingly society was, I would not want to live in a society where it's arbitrary, where you're just walking through the streets and someone could yell out, hey, that person does this and this, and you can get captured. And then what they did was a lot of times was they would rip your body parts from your body, pass them out, and smear themselves with the blood, and wrap their guts around your. I mean, you're talking about some barbaric stuff, some primal stuff, some uncivilized stuff, and the fact that a post-Enlightenment society could get to that level is scary. It's really, really scary, because a lot of times in Western, because that comes from the people, like as people, me, you, and Rob, like we know that tendency exists, where we want to overthrow things, and you get into such a passion, and you hate because there's injustices out there, right? And you end up doing these things, and you end up becoming the thing that you try to destroy, because that's the part that I hate, is the way that they went about it, because they didn't have to. And the reason why I say that is because across the ocean you had the American Revolution, which was very, they tarred and feathered Tories, but that's about the extent of what it got.
Right.
You had some rogue soldiers doing things here and there, but even the generals in the army tried to quell that stuff down. We didn't have a what's his name? The famous British general that went around like just killing everybody. Tarleton, was it Tarleton?
Yeah.
Colonel Tarleton.
Tarleton.
Yeah, we didn't have a sort of.
He was a full-on tyrant.
Like a gentleman. Well, he was like an uncivilized barbaric. Let's just go kill all the women and children because these people were traitors. We were sort of gentlemen in the way we fought our war. We were sort of gentlemen in the way that we had our revolution. And I think the huge contrast is what created the rift, and it's why America didn't really support the French Revolution. Look at these idiots out
so
there.
the United States also didn't have the thousands of years of history before the revolution.
If anything, they barely had around 200.
Right. So the reason why the French Revolution worked was because it was that scary. Was because it brought out that the worst in society and the worst in people. That's the reason why it worked. Like you kind of missing the point on that. Even though it was brutal, even though it's horrific.
I mean, I can understand that.
I can definitely see that.
I can understand that in terms of when you look at most of history, in cases of revolutions, that is the normal case. The American case is actually the oddity in everything. It's an unusual thing. And actually, I think I remember an instance.
War.
Yeah, I remember an instance. I think it was off of the. I think it was by the Soviets during the Cold War. They mentioned all of these different revolutions and saying, it was always good for the people to rise up against an overpowering force, but they never mentioned the American Revolution because it was such an oddity to them. It didn't make sense.
The Bolshevik Revolution led to 9 million dead.
Well, I just think that, it should come down to the ideas, Rob. I think that you can win if you can convince the majority of the people that something is right. You can organize society to affect that type of power because you simply outnumber everyone else. And we will come to find out that actually the aristocrats were not as good as regular people when it came to running a military. They
became decadent.
In the beginning of Napoleon's military career, you see that because it was so meritocratic and because he had wiped out the spoil system that had been going on for years, which the rest of Europe still maintained, he was able to wipe out forces that were, 3 armies to 1. You talk about three soldiers to 1. He was fighting 3 generals to 1, 3 armies to 1. And he was able to just do away with them because his soldiers wanted to fight for him and because his generals were just that much more capable. And because you just had a meritocratic system.
Right, because out of all the previous leaders, he was the most humble, or at least that's what a lot of the people saw in him at the time.
But, that does bring us into Napoleon's military career, which starts right after the French Revolution, because he saw that, well, the people saw that, okay, things are getting too out of control. The guy who started the Reign of Terror ends up getting his head chopped off, which I always think is kind of comical, right?
It's a little comical when you think about it
It's
in
ironic,
hindsight.
Yeah. But yeah, and for the record, Napoleon was never a staunch revolutionary. He was more of an opportunist.
Oh yeah.
And he saw this as an opportunity, like, hey, you know what? I can gain power. I can serve the French state. If they're going to be meritocratic, I got all the merit, so this is going to work out fine. But then what happens after Napoleon sort of, I guess the first mark of his career is when he has that, when he tries to stop the royalists from coming back into the city.
Oh, and he
With the
kills
Austrians.
them with the that cannon shots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was against the Austrians. The Austrians were backing the royal family because the king's wife, Marie Antoinette, she was of the Habsburg bloodline in Austria. So the Austrians had to get involved here, tried to support the family, and then the revolutionaries, this was before Napoleon even took power, said, Napoleon, we need you, take him down, take him down. And he just wipes the floor with them, and it's not just outside of eastern France, he also went into Italy and took them down too.
Yeah, so real quick, it's interesting to point out that at this time there are two republics in the world, right? America and then France. And France is like flanked by, Italy to the south, Spain to the left.
UK to the north.
UK to the north, and then you got all the, the Prussia, Austria, and all of them are like, we got to get rid of this republic because this makes us look bad. People see
or that it's going to spread.
They have a similar system, exactly. They have a similar system to the way the French system was built, and these kings and these aristocrats didn't want to go out the way that the people in their position went out in France. So that's why you saw immediately after the people took over and took control, like Europe basically formed a coalition against France and tried to attack, and that's when they turned to Napoleon.
Yeah, they thought that revolutionary activities, they thought, well, if it was in America, well, that's too far away to do anything. But when it spread to France, many of the monarchies were scared. The British, they were obviously just as scared, but not to the same degree because they still had a parliamentary system at the time, but it could still take them down either way. And they tried using the guise of not only are these ideas destructive in the case of the Reign of Terror, they used that as a pretext to squash the revolution. And obviously that didn't work.
So I just think it's interesting how governments do that, because even today it ends up being whatever your structure of government is, that's who your allies are. Like if you're a dictatorship, you tend to partner up with dictators. If you're a democracy, you tend to partner up with democracies. Socialist states tend to like other socialist states. And I think that whether it was a monarchy or a republic or not, that usually tends to happen. But I guess the next part we can get into is, well, the part that I want to mention is because during this period where Napoleon takes over, he defeats Italy, and he actually comes back home for a while. And he does, I would say, what is the best part of his career, which is he builds a civilization. So he does the
civil law code.
He writes the Napoleonic codes.
He writes the Napoleonic codes, which then goes on to sort of be the standard.
Which is quite a feat for one person to do. I mean, it's pretty incredible.
It is.
Very few people have been able.
No one does that. You imagine like a governor writing down a whole new set of laws for his state.
It hasn't been done since like the early Greeks. The early Greeks and Justinians. Like
Justinian of the Eastern Roman Empire.
Louis XIV actually set a proto civil law code, but it didn't go as far because what a law code does in this instance, because we take it for granted. Somebody does something to you, you have all the full force of the legal system behind you to rectify your wrongs. Whereas back then, it wasn't really like that. You had tribunals set up with arbitrary systems, people making decisions without having to have a huge burden of evidence. Whereas Napoleon really gave people their autonomy. It sort of set the system where, okay, now we have to respect each other's individuality. We're all in this together. No person, no matter who you are, is going to have an upper hand over the other person. And you can say that in principle, and and that's fine. But in practice, it's not going to work if you don't have a legal system to back it up. So to me, that's why that was so impactful. It wasn't just because a civil case happens and you're able to rectify your wrongs, but the sort of it codifies a principle that everybody's equal under the law, and that everyone's autonomy needs to be respected. And that was something that just didn't exist back in the day. it was a huge step forward for the progress of man. And the second thing that he did was he really tried to he invested in science. He invested in mathematics, he invested in the arts, he invested in the culture and architecture, engineering, all the things that make a civilization great. Napoleon understood how this could benefit society, and he was all for it, you know. Like when he goes to Egypt, one of the biggest things he does is he brings along all the historians and all the scholars along with him.
Hundreds of artists, historians to track and to draw all they're doing. He even brought back the Rosetta Stone, right? Or didn't bring it back. He got a bunch of artists to paint it and then decipher it back in France.
There was a story that the Sphinx's nose was blown off during that time.
There was
I'm not sure about that.
But that didn't, that's not actually true.
Everything I said. Oh yeah. By the way, he was destroying history.
He did kill like what 1,500 prisoners in
something
in
like
Egypt.
that.
Yeah, just prisoners of war. It was considered a war crime, but at the same time, these were war prisoners that pledged to not fight in another war, and so when they were caught again fighting, they kind of had their lives forfeited.
Right, and it's even weirder that, well, I don't know weirder, because I would say in terms of strategy, that wasn't a wise decision to go to Egypt. Because he had to leave his men there, and he came back as a hero. So politically speaking, he was able to remain in power, but it was stupid because he wasted an entire army.
I would disagree with that, Nick, because it wasn't stupid, because his idea was smart. Because you can't defeat the British in the sea. Like, they have the Royal Navy. There's absolutely no way to do it. And he knew that, look, England, it's funny how history repeats itself, because England always is saving Europe, you know, which is good. I like England because of that. They do it with Napoleon, they do it with Hitler. And so, you know, he couldn't go to England and conquer England. They wanted him to do that. That was what before he went to Egypt,
He wanted to do that. He wanted to do that, like, personally.
He tried that so many times.
He did afterwards, but initially, when he came back from Italy, because at this time it was run by the Directory. The Directory said, look, we have an assignment for you. You got to go to England and knock out England, because they're the ones that are supporting everyone, because they have the best economy at that time, because they dominate the waves.
They're the ones funding the coalitions.
Yeah, they're funding the coalitions. And so he's like, you know what? That's not the way to do it. Yeah, they're funding everybody, so that's what we should do. We should go after them economically. And so he tried to cut off their ties to India. But what ended up happening was they lost that battle in the sea because of Nelson, Lord Nelson.
Yeah.
At Trafalgar.
Fuck that up.
all praise be to Nelson. You say,
with the HMS Victory.
Yeah, HMS Victory, which he's a cool ass dude, and we should probably talk about him one of these days. But anyway, it was a good strategy. I understand what Napoleon was trying to do, but you can't account for Nelson's greatness, and that's kind of what undid him there. But the fact that he just deserted his army, I think is something like, you know, it takes balls to do that. Like, can you imagine making that decision?
They were pretty capable.
Yeah, well,
the men were capable, but they did not have supplies, and it was going to wear them down eventually. And on top of that,
diseases.
Politically speaking, he was smart to head back to France. Unfortunately, that involved the losing of an army, which could have been used for future purposes. Like, for instance, he probably didn't have to go to Egypt. Instead, he probably could have made an alliance with the Ottomans to take them down, and talked with the Russians to do it.
Afterwards, he actually put an embargo on like Russian
Russian goods,
trades, Russian goods,
because they decided to break with the continental system. Honestly, if Napoleon didn't go to Egypt and focused more on nations such as the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians, it would have been a lot easier to control Europe.
Yeah,
it would have been a lot easier. But this is all speculation.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, you know, hindsight, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I do want to bring up a question. It's kind of tied to what we're talking about, but it goes off a little far field. And that is what he did in Egypt. So he brought down all the artifacts, you know, all the mummies and a bunch of, you know, Egyptian artifacts that were thousands of years old, and they still have them. France still has them. And so I want to ask you guys, because I took a public history course, and this was one of the main things that they're arguing with, or, you know, like some public historians say, you know what, France should keep that because they're preserving it, you know, because if you give it to if you put it back in the Middle East, you know, there's a good chance it's going to be destroyed. And so the French have an obligation to preserve it. And then there's other people that say, well, you should give it back to the original owners. These are Egyptian artifacts. You should give them back to Egypt. So how do you guys come down on, you know, all the sort of artifacts that Napoleon got from these expeditions? Should France give them back, or is that something that you know, they should hold off on?
So it is problematic because they were stolen from these places.
Mm-hmm.
They were stolen, and these places are in turmoil. I mean, these people have lost significant portions of their history, and they can never get it back because it's in another country that they don't even go to. So these museums aren't even paying any reparations. They're not even giving a portion of the income from the museums back to these countries. They just took the artifacts and just left them the way it is. So I don't think necessarily they should give them back, because I think the primary purpose of a museum, besides to make money, is to educate people.
Mm-hmm.
And if these artifacts were still in Egypt or still in other places in the Middle East, they wouldn't be educating people.
Yeah.
And people wouldn't know about this history. So
And it would
I
probably
think
be lost.
at the least, the museums and the collectors of these artifacts should be, paying back to these countries.
Right, or at least compensating them.
Right.
Which I do agree with you on the compensation part. I'm going to say that other than the fact that it was stolen in the middle of a war and it was discovered by them, so I guess you could say that, I guess this is going to sound a little contradictory to what I was just talking about when it came to strategy, but in terms of the preservation of history and knowledge, it's wise of the French to keep those artifacts. And it's the same thing that goes with the British as well, that they're able to better preserve those kind of artifacts. If, for instance, the Rosetta Stone was taken back to Egypt, most likely it's either going to be a forgotten piece of history for the next several centuries until up to this modern time, or it's going to be lost during either a revolution or what happened during the Arab Spring, for instance. A lot of documents could have been lost on this, or further research. So and also, if Napoleon didn't go there, well, it wouldn't be discovered until later on. So it really just depends. I think the French should keep it,
I think the
but
British
I do
discovered
agree.
it first, by the way.
You're right. They
took a lot of it.
technically did,
The
but the
Rosetta
French
Stone?
did grab it.
I thought the French did that.
But either way, I do agree with Rob that people that had those artifacts to begin with and were stolen, whether it's in war or through some type of expedition, they should be compensated. I think that's fair enough.
Yeah. So I think, if you're out there and you're from Egypt, right, you're watching this, which sometimes we do get international viewers, if you can show, I know it kind of sounds like we're lecturing, but these are our objections. These are our opinions. These are our perspectives. You guys can show that you guys can create these museums and have, political stability for, a large amount of time. That sort of takes away all the arguments that we've made, I think, and it creates more of a reason, a justification for European colonial powers to give back everything that they had. Because I do think it's important that, if this is part of your heritage, it does more for an Egyptian to see parts of their history, right, parts of their lineage, than it does a French, so like a French student for the weekend, It's like, oh, that's a cool Egyptian artifact, but then it's sort of it's shallow. Unless he's a true historian or someone who has a special fascination, it's just a shiny object. Whereas for because the same thing happens to me when I see old American objects, or like Spanish objects or like Aztec objects, you feel a connection to it, and I think that connection doesn't have a price on it. And if these artifacts are to be fully utilized, which I believe in, that materials should be fully utilized, that it's best done in Egypt if Egypt can hold on to them responsibly. But I think Rob's right that they're being best utilized right now in France.
At the current moment. Now, there is a compromise that could be done, other than the fact of the home country to obviously make itself more stable. That's a given. But the other instance would be that maybe, well, this is what I like about the modern age, is that we record everything. Everything gets recorded whenever it comes to artifacts, or a lot of things is just straight up recorded, either through papers, books, pictures, or most recently in the last 10 or so years, VR, and digital records.
VR was awesome.
Yeah, and especially through digital records. So I guess in this case, depending on the situation further in the next few decades, that's where I'm going to be saying that, okay, maybe it's about time for the Egyptians to at least, in the case of the Rosetta Stone, start making a court case for it.
Yeah.
But I would say not at the current moment. I don't think it's safe enough for those documents yet. But hey, I could be wrong.
So the next chapter in the story is Napoleon does go on to kick ass in the second, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
I gotta go soon.
You got how much time you got left?
Like 0.
0.
Ooh.
My car is
so
like
Sorry,
parked.
before
man.
you leave, let's go ahead and fast forward. Napoleon, hero, tyrant, or somewhere in between.
Hero, man,
Fine,
that's interesting. Somewhere in between a hero and a tyrant. He accomplished a lot, but he was ruthless. He was sometimes careless. I mean, his battle with Russia kind of demonstrated that.
Yeah.
But he made Europe what it is today, and that says a lot. What do you think?
I'm going to sound like a cheater. Honestly, it's similar to what you're saying, is that in terms of creating Europe, yeah, he did good in that case. Did he create a law code? Of course. Did he kill a lot of his own men? Of course. Did he make bad decisions? Yes, he did, but he's human. Was it smart to go on the warpath?
Did he have 14
really.
mistresses? Sources say more.
Right? Oh my God, can you imagine the mistress stories of that? I actually have a few stories about that. But I would say he's very much a mixed figure. I'd say he's mixed.
What do you say, Jordan?
It's tough because I've never heard anybody out there be pro Napoleon. Usually when
Really?
you do, people throw the sticks and stones at you, right? Because they're like, well, he did a lot of when someone has that much power, and they don't. People expect perfection for some reason. People,
Right,
we're
they
all
expect the
humans.
best.
We all have problems in our lives. When someone has that much power, people expect perfection. Few times people have actually pulled that off. I would say, there were some good Roman emperors. I think George Washington wielded his power very effectively, and then there was the enlightened absolutist powers. And Napoleon does fall short of that, so it's hard to venerate him. But I think that his position in history, this is what I would say, Rob. His position in history is framed as the enemy. He's framed as
Yes,
the
because
boogeyman.
all of Europe was against him.
Yeah, exactly. So the people who wrote about him were these, the establishment, and so
Right.
you got to recognize that. And so the only thing that I would say is kind of like what you guys are saying, but it's that I think we should re-examine Napoleon and look at the things that he did for Europe, and sort of champion those causes and see what does it take for a society to make these substantial leaps in progress. And sometimes, if it's necessary for a strong man to do that, I would say that that's a lesson that we should consider seriously. I'm not saying it's a formula, but I'm saying that
But it's something to consider.
yeah, it's something to consider. And he does have his pluses. He does have his minuses. He was a great civilizational builder, and to me, that's at the top of what I look for in a leader. That's what it is.
Yeah.
In a peacetime situation, if you can, advance science and mathematics, and if you can create a civilization that operates on a fairer basis, like those things are invaluable. People don't recognize them because we live in a society that already has done that. But to bring that order in from the chaos is a huge accomplishment, and I think Napoleon deserves his credit for that.
I guess
and
it
he doesn't
just
really get it, as much.
Yeah, I guess it really just depends on what kind of field we're talking about. Because if it's the military, then you could say it's great. If you could say legally, then that'd be great. If you said human rights or the balance of power,
Well, it's hard to
it get
justify that. I mean,
sketchy.
it's hard to
Yeah,
judge
it's
him
weird
by
how-
today's
yeah.
standards of morals and stuff like that. Because back then,
or even back in those standards
it was worse.
too.
Yeah, but it was still pretty bad.
Here's what I would say is because it's funny that a civilizational builder is what I look to first and foremost, and then the biggest thing that I hate first and foremost is a warmonger. And I think Napoleon was a warmonger. I think that
I don't think he was overcome with like
I would say
bloodlust
he was-
and
I would say he was
quick,
quasi.
He was quick to resort to the sword. He was quick to, there's no way that you fight that many wars without having, if you truly want peace.
what was the percentage? He won 47 out of 53 battles.
Yeah, I mean,
Something
he
like
was
that,
a great general, and because he was great, I think that's why he relied on his military all the time. Like his intervention into Spain was a good example. He didn't have to do that, but he felt like, look, I can use my military and do what I want.
Yeah, he thought he could do
So,
better.
Yeah, so when a leader resorts to the military first and foremost, like you see, do you want a leader that's going to have you embroiled in wars for his entire life? No, it's not what you want. It's going to have like all the youth of your country decimated and killed? No. So I think a smarter leader could have, made some alliances. They could have worked some things out geopolitically. Maybe had to fight some initial wars, but set up a system to where they don't have to fight further wars or give concessions. Because I think that's all that some of these countries wanted. Give some concessions here that you're not going to be
Yeah, you have to be a
in my
diplomat.
backyard or trying to redo Europe.
Yeah, that was one of the major flaws of Napoleon. Well, I guess you could say that's kind of an innate flaw of his, of being a diplomat because of his past. He's used to being a general. He's used to being a military leader, a strong man, and he was trained to be one.
One more question, Rob. So, what do you think, from a psychological perspective, motivated Napoleon? What got him up every morning? What drove him to accomplish the things that he accomplished? What drove him to have the vision that he had?
So there's something people falsely called a Napoleon complex, of him believing he is smaller and more inadequate than most people, which is what led him to a tyrannical, in a way, rule of other people. I think that's pretty false and kind of
Biased?
it is extremely biased. Yes, I don't think it's right at all. The Napoleon complex. It's not a real thing. I would say so. Yeah, from a psychological perspective.
Yeah.
But what made him get up every single day and fight for a better future?
Do you think it was for him? Do you think that
I think it was for
justice?
the greater good of all of Europe to change.
See, because I think that's what answers the question. It's like, it's not his means, it was his ends.
Right.
And if Napoleon really did truly want to free the people of Europe, then I think that I could make an argument that he was a good man if that's what he wanted to do. He was dumb in the way he did it, but at least his intentions were good. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that at a certain point he did want to bring freedom, but I think that Napoleon he had a quote that said, "I love power like a musician loves their music."
Yeah.
And so he was just someone who was power hungry.
Yeah.
And he saw that, if I can get the people on my, he's probably opportunistic. Look, if I want to conquer Europe, and the biggest argument that I have for that is because when he conquers Europe, he sends his family out to be kings of all of Europe.
Yeah, his brothers.
Yeah, that screams ambition and it screams power.
Yeah.
Because if you really wanted to liberate people, you would have did like the Americans did in France. You liberate it and you let them run it.
Yeah, it's like good luck.
You say good luck. We'll support you in the future. Here's some Hershey bars. Go about your way. You don't put Churchill's cousin to rule that part of the country. So I think there's evidence against that, Rob. But if you look at but I'm sure that played a huge part in it. I wouldn't say that I'm sure that he thought, at least that was the argument that he was using. And so you can never see what's in a man's heart. But I'm sure that Napoleon did, at some level, understand the importance of human freedom and human autonomy.
Yeah, I think so too. So last question, kind of on a personal basis. Do you guys have a favorite Napoleon quote by chance?
That's a bit difficult. Well, I don't remember the exact wording of it, but it was in a book called Napoleon in Russia. I believe the author, was Michael B. Adams. And his quote was something along the lines of that he had to be careful of two things. One of the Colossus of the North being the Russians. And then there's another one, which I can't really confirm at the moment. I'm not really sure if that was a true quote, but he made a mention of China. And his mention of China, which at that time, it wasn't seen as a very powerful nation. Maybe a regional power in the modern sense, but not a very strong one at that.
Medieval power.
I would say, I guess so. But what Napoleon said was that China is the sleeping dragon. The minute it wakes up, it's going to shake the world.
Oh, great quote.
Yeah. And it looks like that's very much a true thing. And honestly, he didn't exactly follow the quote of the Colossus of the North. If that was the case, he probably should have decided not to invade Russia. But that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah. So my favorite one is just his sort of perspective on like the human, the human condition. Because he goes to Egypt and he's there and they actually fight in front of the pyramids. And he tells his soldiers, like as a way to just boost the morale of his soldiers, he tells them, he says, fight for your lives. 20 centuries of history look down upon you from the top of these pyramids. And I thought that quote right there sort of, a good philosophy, a good quote, a good truthful statement that no one has thought of will make you dizzy. It'll make you dizzy because it'll make you sit back and think, wow, look, what are the implications of that statement? And it is interesting, you know, like 20 centuries of humanity looked down upon you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, when you're there in front of these pyramids and you realize that, it sort of sets the story of humanity into a certain light that I think is interesting. And to come from a leader like that shows that he was vastly intelligent, you know, and
Sure.
understood humanity.
Mine would be quite different from both of yours. Very simple,
How dare
very,
you, bro.
very simple, and a very telling quote of his. I forget the battle it was in, but he made such ambitious and kind of stupid moves in this battle, but won it. His quote was, "Impossible? I don't know the meaning of the word." And then he sent his Polish cavalry to charge into a line of cannons to take them.
I want to say that was in the Russian
Insane.
campaign. I want to say that might have been the
I
Battle
think
of
he fought,
Borodino.
I think he fought Austria, but I'm not too sure.
I don't know, because the Polish cavalry wouldn't show up until like about 1806 and after, give or
It
take.
was some cavalry. I don't think it matters. That's the irrelevant part. Was
well,
it
here's
it
the-
Persian cavalry? Was it
the-
African cavalry?
Wouldn't have been
well, here's
either
the-
of
The
those.
point is that there's cavalry out there, and he's charged, or there's cannons,
Well,
right?
the thing
He-
is
he-
that the
yes,
Polish
he
cavalry
sent
were
his
famous.
Polish. Yes,
they were
the
famous.
best.
Yeah.
They were the fucking best. And he told them, he's like, "Poles, fetch me those cannons.
Yeah.
Like, go
Get them.
Yeah.
So so that does show his sort of boldness, and when you have a leader like that,
Mm.
you're willing to do anything for him, even
And they did.
and they did.
Oh, they
And a
did
lot of
for
times
sure.
They paid the price for it. So,
All right, you want to wrap this up, Jordan?
well, I mean, Rob, I think me and Nick will continue to
All right.
All right.
finish up the story.
Unplug.
But, yeah, it's kind of fun, huh?
Yeah. There's no strategy, you guys.
All right.
Rob Dale, everyone. Woo. Thank you for joining us.
Yo, so we'll walk behind
All
the
right.
camera.
All right. See ya.
Hey, is it still working? Still good?
All right. Cool beans.
All right. So, Nick, I still feel like we're early on in the innings here. Oh, but I do gotta watch the Astros, so we kind of gotta wrap this up. But
Okay.
let's go for another 20, 25 minutes. And now in the story, I think we're at, let's jump to Austerlitz.
Ooh.
about-
Okay.
Talk about what we see from Napoleon there, and quickly talk about his military genius, because I think that's an aspect that we've a
Kind of,
huge part of his
yeah.
character, a huge part of what made him, huge part of what made him successful, and should be a huge part of any conversation about Napoleon.
Of course. I mean, it's Napoleon. So where do you want to touch up on? Either the opposition, like leadership such as Kutuzov and Alexander the First of the Russians
It's called
and
the
the
Battle
Austrians.
of Three Emperors. So
Yeah, the Battle of the Three Emperors. Well, honestly, that did not go well because, how do I put this? They did not plan things ahead of time. Because what Napoleon did that was interesting was that he did something that not many Europeans did at this time and before, and it was making their army more mobile. And here's how he did it. How he did it was that he broke up his army into smaller pieces, I guess, corps, if you will, into corps. And what they would do is that they would take separate roads. That way, not only would it fan out through a larger field and find out where the enemy is, and if they ever get sneak attacked, that one corps is going to hold them back until the rest of the army shows up. Not only that, it's able to move faster instead of a long train, and they don't have to rely on a supply train as well. They could just focus on living off the land, as it seems, and then respond in kind. Also, remember when I said that when the enemy army comes in and starts attacking the corps, the rest of the army is going to be notified, and they're going to have to plan out how to beat the enemy. And if I remember right, in the Battle of Austerlitz, what happened there was that Napoleon split his army into two. The smaller one was going to bait the other emperors to come attack him up into a hill, where Napoleon got the rest of his army to go around, surround, nearly wipe them out. And that was the general plan of what he did. And later on in other campaigns, whenever the armies tried to split themselves up, even if their numbers were far larger than Napoleon would still somehow win through numbers. And the way he did this was, with his corps, again, he would find out where the smaller detachments are, and then he would get the majority of the army to go after that detachment, wipe it out, and then move from the next one to the next one. So that's an interesting policy that Napoleon did, and it's something that the other European monarchs just could not wrap their heads around.
Yeah,
they couldn't figure it out.
In the beginning, Napoleon was so far ahead in his tactical advantages, his strategic advantages. His soldiers were better soldiers. His generals were better generals. They were able to operate independently of any. Like you said, it wasn't a centralized system. His generals and his officers had some autonomy to act and to respond in certain situations, and that sort of gave them. It was a huge advantage because their military apparatus was really in the modern age, whereas their enemies were still in the pre-industrial age.
Yeah.
So it was huge. Now they continue to sort of meet him and adopt his tactics. And when I say that Napoleon was someone who was good for Europe, at least in freeing the people, one of the ways that Prussia responded, and I forgot where I read this because I think it's after he defeats Prussia the first time. So this might be like in the Fourth Coalition. This is a little bit further in the story. But I guess I should set this up here and sort of build the suspense.
Yeah.
So Prussia was really the first proto-modern military. So when I say that pre-industrial, I'm talking about Austria, I'm talking about Russia, and
the French, the Spanish.
No, not the French, and the Spanish, and the Italians. But the Prussians actually fought in a system that was very comparable. They were light years ahead of the other European powers, at least up to that point.
Decades, easy.
Yeah, decades, because they were disciplined. They had their soldiers in a line. They just had better tactics, and so they knew what to do in every situation. They knew how to survive off the land. But the problem is that their soldiers were conscripted. They weren't really levied from the people. So they weren't, and the only way that they were kept there, only way that they were disciplined is through harsh consequences. So if you did anything and tried to get out of line, you tried to run away, you were dead, you were shot, you were tortured. And so what the Prussians tried to do, and you can be effective through fear in this way, but as you will see, the French sort of figure out a way that's better than this, that's loyalty. But the Prussians would try to make the soldiers more scared of their officers than they were of the enemies.
And seen them as the strong man, strong men.
So it's interesting because when you hear these battles, they show that Prussians are fighting innumerable odds. They're surrounded on all sides, and if they instinctively know to turn their lines to fire in both sides, and their routing percentages are very, very low, and their firing rates are just really, really high.
Yep.
Just everything you look for in a military is as good as it can be. And so you fast forward to Napoleon's age. Napoleon has the advantages because his troops want to fight for him, and because he has more innovations than the Prussians have, because he has the core innovations. And so because he wipes the floor with all the other armies of Europe.
It was pretty easy. It was just the Prussians that actually Napoleon was worried about.
And it was the Prussians that sort of the British and everyone else put their hopes in. They're like, you know what? Napoleon's been beating sort of the JV team. He's been beating the second tier teams, but now he's gonna fight the champion. Now he's gonna fight the current champion, the Spartan of the age, if you will.
Yeah, the Sparta of the North.
Sparta of the North. And he fights the Prussians, and he ends up, not only does he beat them, but I think it's the Battle of Jena. Battle of Jena.
Yep.
And Napoleon actually doesn't even command a good fight in this particular instance, because he has like 6 corps with him, and he ends up not even giving orders to 2 of the corps, and 1 corps is off and it's lost on its own. It's not doing anything. But because his units are so tight, because his units are so experienced, and because his soldiers fight for a cause that they believe in, he's able to defeat the rear guard, or I think it's the vanguard, the front of the Prussian army, and he has is Davout's a general? Would you say Davout is a brigadier general?
I believe he was a brigadier general, or possible. No, not a field marshal. But anyway.
So at this point, the French are so far ahead of even the Prussians that he has one single corps. It's called Davout's Third Corps, and Davout's a general badass after this. But his one corps is able to sort of scout and outflank the main army of the Prussians and defeat the main army of the Prussians. Napoleon, meanwhile, is a few miles in front of that or behind that, depending on where you're looking at the map. And he's thinking that he defeated the main army, whereas Davout really defeated the main army. One corps defeated an entire army. I mean, it's a huge
pretty
thing.
hilarious.
Yeah, it's an amazing accomplishment. But that's how far ahead of the tactics that the French were able to instill.
Right.
And the response to that was that, I mean, Prussia was a smart military power. Frederick had basically made them a militaristic power. They favored, they really thought that military was the most important aspect of a civilization. And a lot of their brain power of the civilization, a lot of their genius went to having a formidable military power. So they responded quite early, quite effectively, and they made the necessary reforms. And one of those reforms was they figured out that, hey, look, we can no longer use drunks in our army, captured runaway slaves, pirates. We actually need to start taking from our people. And they didn't want to take away from their people, because you take away from your farmers, you take away from your artisans, and it sort of leaves you, it takes away from your overall economy and your
that's what made the Prussians.
basis.
That's what made the Prussians a little bit special compared to the rest of Europe. Also, before I continue on, actually, the president of the Wisdom Factory, Preston Nieves, he has a podcast that's going to be coming up where I'm involved with him as well. That's going to be posted soon. If not, it's already been posted on Prussia itself.
Yeah.
So you'll be getting more details about the Prussians.
Yeah.
But anyway, because I was involved in that, I'm going to give a little bit of detail of the Prussians.
Well, real quick,
a little bit.
let me say the impact here. I'll make it quick, Nick. So one of the things that he does in these military reforms, and he does try to sort of create another core system. He does try to create a system where they're aware of their flanks and all of these things. But the single most important reform that they do is they actually abolish the feudal system. They actually abolish, in large segments of their society, the system of where you have to be a slave and you have no power, because they realize, look, if people are going to be invested in this army, we have to give them more freedoms. And so because of Napoleon's victory militarily, you see a more opening up of Prussian society. And it wasn't a total opening up. I mean, it's still a kingly system, but that was one of the things that they needed to do, because they needed to create an allegiance to the Prussian army from the Prussian people. So I thought that's a huge leap forward if you're for the freedom of man. And Prussia was able to, they were forced to make that reform to respond to Napoleon. But anyway,
it's interesting with the Prussians. I know that we're kind of slightly going off topic, but the Prussians, it gives a little bit of background as to why the Europeans at the time of Napoleon saw the Prussians as the only thing that could possibly stop Napoleon. Because honestly, the only nations that Napoleon actually feared, other than the British, were the Prussians. And the reason for it was Frederick the Great, who built Prussia to become what Prussia became, to build Prussia to what it is during the Napoleonic age. But the problem why Prussia was able to be defeated by Napoleon was that the Prussian system was good. It had a military culture, and it did have systems where it was a hybrid between what you're going to find in most kingly states and a little bit of what you're going to find in Napoleonic France and even the United States or Britain. But the problem with this system is that it required a truly strong, good man or a great man. And the problem was it was hard to go above the bar of Frederick the Great.
Yeah.
Frederick the Great was a major micromanager. After he passed away, no one could fit his spot. So eventually, the entire system started degrading. So oddly enough, it was weakening by the time Napoleon came into power. So, and also they were resting on their laurels.
Yeah.
They followed older systems of combat, which is kind of contradictory to what Frederick the Great said or what he wanted. He wanted a system that was going to constantly adapt to any situation, constantly go on innovation, adaptability, and training. But by the time of Napoleon, they followed old systems.
Well, to their credit, after Napoleon defeated them, they were the quickest to actually do
True.
all of those things that you said. So it was a little bit too late. Like after they lost,
Yeah, after they lost.
Let's follow what Frederick told us to do.
Yeah,
Maybe we should do that.
They got a wake-up call.
Yeah, they got a wake-up call.
It's kind of funny with the Prussians because you'll know this when you watch the Prussia podcast, that whenever they did foreign policy, they're super optimistic. Like they're almost as optimistic as Napoleon, if not, in my opinion, more in terms of a society. So they'll take any advantage that they could possibly get to get stronger. during the Napoleonic Wars, that was the only time that Prussia decided to jump into the ring, which is funny because other than that instance, they were always the strongest power in Europe, or at least in Central Europe. Because part of the reason also why they failed was because they jumped into the fight expecting that the Russians and the Austrians would help them in this campaign, but the Russians were already back in their territory, while the Austrians were just beaten back and trying to rebuild their army to come back and fight Napoleon. So Napoleon went straight to Prussia, knocked them out of the ring, and then started going after the others.
Yeah, and I think this was a little bit before that, but another notable military accomplishment that sort of leads to the, to the modern age is when he destroys the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so Napoleon
In 1806, I believe.
Pretty much ends the Holy Roman Empire system, and that sort of ugly, interconnected network of
the Confederation of the Rhine.
Yeah, well, he creates the Confederation of the Rhine, which is basically trying to be a buffer between France and to the Eastern warring powers that are against him. But that sort of does create a, more, because at this point you're starting to see the Germans become more and more united, and they're still not united up until this point. But it's the evolution of a German state takes one giant leap forward with the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the start of the Confederation of the Rhine. So that's one thing that he did. Is there anything you want to say about that, or you want to go ahead and move into Russia?
After that, obviously the Holy Roman Empire was taken down, and this is after the time of that the Austrians actually tried renovating themselves to go after the French, and they did really well. They did surprisingly well, which kind of shocked the Prussians a bit, and also the British. But they were quickly defeated, partially because of the emperor deciding to make bad decisions, and this is what led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. And at this time, Napoleon started getting the idea that he had to become a true monarch. How do you become a true monarch? You have to be recognized by other monarchs. He wasn't recognized by them, but if he married a princess of one of them, then he would be recognized. So he forced the Austrians to give him one of the daughters so that he could marry and have a child with, which he did. And depending on what you read, the Austrian princess might have actually fallen in love with him, but it was years ahead, even though he had like multiple mistresses, one of which were the Poles. But anyway, that's just a little bit of interesting facts.
He loved love too much, but
hey, he's French. What do you expect?
And so it didn't really work out for him because the Austrians, when you have a wife, you're not supposed to fight with the house, right? Of whatever her house is.
Oh yeah.
Austrians don't care. They rip that up. They're like, you know what? We're still going to attack. And so the interesting part about the next chapter, I think we should talk about, is the amount of coalitions that.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Because for any budding politician out there or diplomat, you can't make this mistake, and that is to allow 7 different coalitions. It was 6, but it took 6 to take down Napoleon, but there was a 7th when he returns from Elba. But so Napoleon, as we've said, you're like, wow. If you don't know much about him, you're like, well, he keeps on winning. He keeps on winning. What's the problem here? Everywhere he goes, he wipes the floor with people. The problem is he wipes the floor with them, he makes a deal with them, and he doesn't really have harsh concessions, at least not like historically harsh, barbaric harsh, where he's destroying things and taking away all of their booty. All he does basically is says, look, I want peace, give me a little bit of territory here, and then you have to send me money and send me troops and cannons and all of these things.
And block off the British trade.
And then here's the one thing, he's like, and then promise not to fight me again. And that's where they always renege, and that's where that never seems to work out, because Napoleon believes he has too much pride, and he believes, okay, I've defeated them at such a top-down rate, like at such a what's the word for it? Such a he basically beats them to a pulp, and he thinks that that's enough to discourage them from trying to fight him again. And it doesn't. No matter how hard he beats one of these European powers, they always rise up to fight him again. And so the first 5 coalitions, as you get to the 5th, he's winning, but by less of an outside.
Yeah, they're starting to learn.
Yeah, they're starting to learn. And by the 5th coalition, he's losing his men, and he's losing like the greatest part of his officer, well, not his officer corps, but the greatest part of his soldiery. And he has to supplement his military because he can no longer use the soldiers the way that he did. He has to supplement it with cannons. So now he has like 5 times as much from his first battles. He has like 5 times as much cannon, which sort of limits his mobility, which is what gave him the strike force, the sort of blitzkrieg power that he had in the beginning.
Plus, he started getting overstretched.
Yeah,
in the Peninsular Campaign being the most famous, but also keeping power throughout Europe, because a lot of the nations, when they found out, when they started realizing that it's only a matter of time till that machine starts falling apart due to the strain of having constant coalitions. It was only a matter of time if he didn't end them fast enough, which is the reason why he decided to marry the Austrian princess.
He was getting desperate, like to end these.
Yeah, he was slowly getting desperate.
So the point I wanted to make, Nick, is that Napoleon, when it comes to negotiating a victory, I think that's something that's super important. Americans, we did that pretty well in the Civil War. We negotiated a victory. We sort of incorporated the South, and there was never a huge rupture like that again. Yeah, you had the Jim Crow, you had civil rights problems, but those things were managed internally, and the conflict never really got to that level again. And you see, ever since World War II, we were able to create this United Nations international system that has survived up until the current day, and which has largely been a promoter of peace in Europe, which hasn't been seen since probably ever. And a lot of that has to do with the way that they negotiated the peace treaties, the way that they negotiated these things.
Conflicts in Europe have almost completely disappeared.
Exactly. And so it allowed for a period of unprecedented freedom and prosperity in these programs in these different societies where it can raise the standard of living for the people. But you see a contrast, even in the modern age, with the way they handled World War II and the way they handled World War I. World War I is basically the opposite of what Napoleon did. So Napoleon basically let them off easy. He said, look, don't fight me again, give me some money, and that's it. That's all I require. Whereas after World War I, it was kind of like, all right, give me everything, every dollar that you have, and de-industrialize, and you can't never have a military again. And so you have two opposite things which accomplish the same thing, two opposite ways which end up resulting in the same thing, which is more war. So that's what a good treaty should, stave off. And I think that's where Napoleon failed, because there shouldn't have been a 4th and 5th and 6th coalition. He should have been able to handle that. And that's the interesting, if you want to talk about revisionist history, I think that's the interesting point, Nick. And so let's try to put on our policy hats. Let's try to put on our diplomatic hats, or our ruler hats. And how could we have negotiated with these other powers to prevent them from mobilizing against him again and again and again?
Well, if we do it it's much easier if we do it by hindsight. If we don't, then roughly it's going to be about the same. There may be some differences, but not by much. But if we go by hindsight, then Napoleon, once he took power, my recommendation would be actually to be even softer. Now, let me explain this, because when you said that when he went after all of the other European powers, he took money, he took some of the governments over, took land, took soldiers, and told them, you are to listen to exactly to what I say, and you are to listen to it. You are to never disobey me in this case, because I beat you in a freaking war. That's not exactly a good thing. Because what that creates is you either have to do one of two things. You have to be extremely harsh, or you have to be pretty lenient. You can't do somewhere in the middle. And if you do somewhere in the middle, you have to prove it on the field multiple times. Or you have to have a history of doing that, which in France's history, that is not a common thing. They almost never do that, at least up until the modern era. So I would say my recommendation for the French, it would be that I wouldn't really take any territory. I wouldn't really, actually better, I would not install puppet governments.
Yeah.
Because that, to the other European powers, they saw that as a threat that was going to be used against them later on in the future. Basically saying that, oh look, that he's installing puppets that are going to be used in a war to take me down later. So, but that also means that I'm still good enough that he has to put that into consideration. So that means I have to go to war with him again to take him down before he starts solidifying his power. That's how the rest of the Europeans saw it.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good answer, Nick. You know, the puppet system was a little bit scary. What I would say is that he had to, because all of this is being done at the behest of the British. The British command the seas. The British own, you know, and so they're able to facilitate trade, and they're able to bypass his continental system. And I think that's where the problem lies.
Oh, you're right. That's another one.
He had to recognize that there can't be one man dominating the European continent. There has to be a balance of power. And I think that that's what he should have done, was try to create that balance.
Or rather, he didn't take advantage of the balance of power.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I would say that he tried to be the end all be all, you know. And so you can't do that, because then people are going to constantly fear you, and then they're going to get together and say, well, we need to take out the big guy because he's going to, you know,
he's going to eat us later.
Yeah, because he's going to eat us later. Whereas if you have a balance, where if you have a, you know, mutually assured destruction type thing, then, you know, things level off. And the way he could have accomplished that was by doing whatever it was necessary to ally with England. I think if you have an alliance with England, that sort of keeps England,
or even just peace with them would be enough.
Yeah, I would say peace might be enough, but you know, the English might have still been trying to double deal there, because they didn't like Napoleon, and they saw Napoleon as just this really evil figure. But I think that's why I think an alliance might have been a little bit more insurance. But I mean, you could go with general peace. It's a step in the right direction. But here's the thing, Nick, is if you have England and France, that sort of creates a balance. I mean, it doesn't from the European
in Western Europe
sense, because like if you're not in that alliance, it seems like you're not powerful. But you know, if the British could have got them to agree to leave the other countries alone and just to, you know, consolidate the things that you've gained. So the Confederation of the Rhine, Italy, might have kept those, but I think that he should have found a way to make friends with England. And so if you're a country, and how that applies with us today, if you're in a position where you're a diplomat, or you have to recognize how alliances can either ensure your security or destroy you. And with America, I think that's something that we constantly have to reevaluate. You know, what are our alliances, and how valuable are these alliances, and how do these alliances set up a balance of power in the world that can ensure our security? And because if you're in an alliance or if you're not in an alliance like France was, it's just going to bode bad for you, because everyone else is going to get against you. But if you're in an alliance with weak powers, it's going to do you the same. But if you're in an alliance with another power that would otherwise be an adversary, that can be a really good thing in certain situations.
See, that's where Napoleon was kind of smart when he decided to have an alliance with the Russians. One, because he could keep a better eye on them, and also they can both go to the center of Europe together. At least that was the plan. I disagree about getting an alliance with the British, because the problem with that is it was too soon. That's too soon. I mean, because they have always been enemies. The British and the French had always been enemies for centuries, ever since, or even before, the 100 Years' War. So that's about.
But they've allied a good amount of times as well. Not more times.
Well,
than
that's
they fought,
after the
they
Napoleon.
No, I'm talking about before. Like during the medieval era, there was a few times where they were allied. They were
Crusades?
allies. Well, the Crusades is an example.
Well, what other case? Because I can only think of the Crusades. You may be able to make an argument against. Well, not really against the Spanish. I'm trying to think of the Habsburgs, maybe, but not really. Yeah, it's not a true alliance. And
I'm sure there was a few times when it wasn't the.
They may have agreed on a few things.
The War of the Spanish Succession, but there were a few times when they allied to fight Spain. They allied to fight. It might have been Scandinavian countries, but there was a few wars. It wasn't always. It was more. They were more against each other than they were. But you know. I think Napoleon still could have negotiated something that's a temporary alliance, not a permanent alliance.
That's the problem with the rival. Well, that's how the British and the French always saw themselves as rivals. The only times when they didn't was what we were just been talking about, a common enemy. Yeah. And the most famous case is when Germany got united, because Germany started encroaching on Britain's dominance of the seas,
Yeah.
and France with its colonial possessions and pieces of French territory when Germany united. So that's why the British and the French got together for the first time, truly the first time,
Oh,
to
remember
take down the
there
Germans.
was that alliance when the French, I think it was during, who's the famous King Henry? He's the famous, the fat English king.
King Henry the
Eighth?
I think it's the
Yeah,
eighth.
yeah. So you remember when there was that meeting between the French king and the and King Henry the Eighth when they were in, I think it was Paris, and there was what was it called? The Parade of the Rugs or something like that. I don't know, but there was this great détente period where the two kings got together, and it was supposed to be a peacemaking situation. Like they had put all the problems aside, but the problem is that King Henry VIII got drunk and he challenged the French king to a wrestling match. And the French king, and because he was a bigger guy and he thought he was more manly, and that he thought the French king was a little bit more feminine, and he just didn't have the build of the English king. But the French king ended up beating him.
That's funny.
In this wrestling match. Man, I forget what it's called. It's called the Parade of the Rugs or something like that, man. Oh, I don't know.
You see, that's the thing. There's a difference between a détente
Yeah.
and an alliance.
It was a huge party. It was a huge celebration that was supposed to bring together this alliance. But because the kings had gotten to this fight, and because the English king got so humiliated, that sort of ended it right there. He goes home and he's like, "Oh, these French, I can't deal with these French." So I get what you're saying, Nick. There is this bad blood between them, but there's bad blood between all of these European powers. And when it comes to it, they can make peace. And so, like, if Napoleon would have gave some sufficient, because remember, I'm not talking about a permanent alliance. I'm just talking about stopping
Trying to go cordial.
Stopping perpetual war. And to stop perpetual war, he could have made a temporary alliance that would have allowed him to sort of build himself up, to defend himself, which could have sort of stopped England from seeing his demise. So
I would say it would require a very uneasy peace and some severe concessions. Yeah. Like they need to draw some to very definite borders before they can even do something like that.
Yeah, Napoleon
so
would have had to make some
I would say that would be extremely difficult. But if Napoleon's able to accomplish it, then I'd be saying great.
But Nick, you have to look at it as what's the alternative? All right, the alternative is nothing.
Alternative is the British tried to do an amphibious invasion, which they did try, and Napoleon beat them.
No, what I'm saying, the alternative is you foment the coalitions. You foment coalitions.
Well, here's the thing. If you're friendly with the other nations on Europe, or at least not to the same degree that Napoleon did in real life, well, they're less inclined to do it. Also, if you don't do the continental system, if you don't, no, because he tried to strong arm all the nations, and they saw that as a threat, and they decided to revolt. And it's the same thing with the Spanish monarchy too, on top of that. If Napoleon did not do any of that, and maybe expanded into places like Belgium, Alsace-Lorraine, minor gains, or even into Italy, and maybe the Confederation as puppet states, or the Federation of the Rhine as like a buffer zone, then that's fine.
The main catalyst for all of these coalitions is England. So even if you have an alliance with a few of these European states, you still have England, who's going to fund Portugal, who's going to fund Russia, who's going to fund whoever you're not allied with. England is going to be a thorn in their side.
That's why the French made an alliance with the Russians, and the Portuguese, they didn't really do anything to the French. The only thing they did anything to the French in regards to that is that they allowed trade with the British so that the trade could go through Portugal into Spain, and then from Spain all the rest of the continent, which he should not have done the continental system because that just angered opposition. So what I'm saying honestly is getting rid of any instance or the majority of instances where you're giving them a reason to come at you. Now, this is where I would say, now the only major flaw I could say right now in this system would be that the fact that he's not a true monarch. He's of a lower nobility.
He's an emperor.
He only got that when he took the crown from the Pope, but the monarchs did not see it that way. They just saw that as a pretender, a fake, a phony. That's why he decided to marry an Austrian princess to get that legitimacy, and even then, that was barely workable, if not almost workable.
Oh yeah, there was this quote. I think it was like a Russian ambassador. He had said something Or no, it was, man, who was it? It might have been a Prussian ambassador, something like that. Someone who talked to one of Napoleon's first ministers. Napoleon's minister, who was actually a leftover from the king system, the monarchy. He was a marquis, and he told the marquis, he said, "It's funny because in Russia, the king, I mean the emperor is civilized, but the people are not, and in France, the people are civilized and the emperor is not." So it was a funny situation, and that you could look at it that way, civilized in the way of being a courtly type person,
Being diplomatic.
well, not diplomatic, but sort of having the sort of manners, the norms, living under the norms that a normal prince would, and a king would.
True,
a sort of
Napoleon was
marquis would. There's a certain code of behavior that goes
Yeah,
along with
Napoleon was crass.
that. Yeah, and exactly, Napoleon was sort of more dynamic. He didn't care about all those norms. He didn't care about holding back what he thought or felt, or he didn't behave to any sort of standard other than his own. And that is a modern thing. That rugged individuality is a very modern idea, and I think it starts with the French Revolution. But anyway, so another thing that I want to say, which because I still advocate for going after England would have been the best way, but I do see what you're saying, that he looked like a threat either way. And so that's where I can meet you in the middle, is because if you're going to create an alliance, you have to make sure that you're operating your government or your civilization in a way that is not arbitrarily tyrannical. And I think that's why
That was a key.
That's why they feared Napoleon. Like if Napoleon would have been someone who was seen as more just, or as more reasonable, or more accommodating, or less ambitious,
or even at the very least ministers that could do it, then that might be just enough.
Yeah, but the way that Napoleon ran his system was very militaristic, and I think that sort of made it look like you can't deal with him. He's a threat that needs to be eliminated. He's not a peaceful power. Like if Napoleon would have been a ruler who sort of he won the Battle of the Third Coalition, and then he goes home and he tries to build up France into an economic powerhouse, a manufacturing powerhouse, and then he builds massive trade networks with Europe and creates products and sort of facilitates trade and sort of helps fund his the other countries' ambitions. Like if he would have been an economic powerhouse at that time and sort of been a free trader or something like that, he could have been seen as a more useful power.
This would also be something of interest, that this is why I would advocate for the projected peace or even a detente, because the British definitely saw Napoleon as a threat when it came to land. The only time that they were ever scared was around just before Trafalgar, because Napoleon had an alliance with the Spaniards, and they were able to build a navy that was very dangerous to the British. So in this terms of peace, he could do a slow buildup of his navy, just enough to either protect the borders or even blockade Britain, which would obviously be further down the line, but that's a pretty good policy if you're able to act on it, if you can wipe out the navy. Because that's the only way you're ever going to truly defeat the British, is that you either starve them out or you have an amphibious invasion, which, as we all know, that has rarely happened.
Right. But so like as far as the way that Napoleon sort of ruled, I think that that's something that needs to be taken into account, because you have rulers that are more seen as more reasonable, more just, and Napoleon was like very arbitrary. It had to be his way, and someone like that, it's like you don't want to deal with him. It's very hard to make an alliance with that person. And Talleyrand tried. I think that he sort of also saw that, like, look, Napoleon is not long for this world. He's arbitrary. He only wants what he wants. And in this world where there's all these different powers, it's just not going to happen. So moving on, I think let's get on to his decline. We talked about his rise, talked about him kicking ass everywhere. But I think you can mark his decline when he chooses to go after Russia, because they want to defy the continental system. And he does invade them, and he takes this huge, 300,000 men? Or was it a million?
No, it was like 600,000.
600,000?
Like at least 500,000.
Yeah.
And about I think like almost 3/4 of them were French. The rest were from all across Europe.
Yeah, so I think this was the
Grand Army.
no, that's not mine. I think it was the largest mass of men that had ever been amassed at that point in history, period. Maybe you have to go back into the ancient, classical era days where there were some huge Persian armies maybe. But this was pretty much it for the longest of time. And they marched into Moscow.
Yep.
And the whole way he's going there, the Russians are operating off of this system of scorched earth. So everywhere he goes, the towns are burnt down. He's got nowhere to stay. He's got nowhere to sleep.
Yep.
Everywhere he goes, the farmers are burning their own stocks because they're sacrificing themselves for Russia. And so they got nothing to eat. Their supply lines are stretched, and their soldiers, their morale is low. And then they get to Moscow, and they're like, okay, well, we got somewhere to stay. We got a place that should have food. Maybe there's going to be some ladies.
The king's going to give us the peace treaty soon.
Yeah, we're going to win this battle, and nope. Go to Moscow.
They stay there for a month.
Where are the Russians? They stay there for a while, and then Russia sends agents to set the city on fire. And this is right before the harsh winter season is going to come. And so, Moscow is burned, and they can't stay there. And Napoleon has to make a tough decision. He's like, we got to get closer to our supply lines. We cannot make it out here. I might lose half my army over there, but if I stay here, I'll lose the whole damn thing. And so he goes on this. I mean, it's just a horrible march, and I mean,
and he's being harassed not just from the peasantry, but also the Cossacks.
Yep, the Cossacks. Yep, they're harassing him. And I remember hearing about this one, just to give you an illustration of how bad this is and how much trouble his army was going through. Is there was a river that they had to cross, and this was like I picture it's blizzard. There's all this snow. You can barely see what's in front of you.
The classic paintings of the march.
And the Cossacks were behind them, pushing them in the rear guard. And these soldiers, they were in no position to fight at this time. They were underfed. They were undermanned in some situations, and so they had to cross this river. And because the bigger army was coming after them, and they didn't have anything the river didn't have anything there, so they had to engineer a way to cross this bridge, and it was a long river. And so they have paintings of it. And so these soldiers had to go in the water, and you're talking maybe negative 20 degrees.
Yeah.
And they're dying every day, and you have to keep sending new men, and you have to keep trying to build this thing, and it keeps one time it topples over, and you have to restart, and trying to build this bridge over this long river where you have all these kind of men in the water. And some people die simply by falling. Like if you're trying to go over the bridge and you fall into the water, you die simply by shock right there. So you got these people that are sacrificing themselves to build this bridge so that the French can get across. And then by the time they finish the bridge and half the army gets across, the Cossacks are there.
Yep,
and
constantly harassing.
And they destroy everyone else. They set the bridge on fire, and it's just like it's a nightmare of a time. And by the time the French soldiers get back to outside of Russian territory, what is it? They're
so
like one eighth of what they were when they left.
Something like that. So few men were left.
The Grand Army is officially destroyed, and a general is only as good as the army he's got.
And those were all of the trained ones.
Yeah. And so at this point, he has to turn to 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds.
Does this sound familiar? It sounds very 1941, 42 to 44-ish.
There's so many parallels to this period in history and to the German
Operation Barbarossa,
trying to conquer Europe with the Allies and all those things. But so you have that, and after that, it's pretty much downhill from there. The coalition sees, or the Sixth Coalition sees that they got Napoleon on the run. They challenge him to a battle. I'm not sure what the decisive battle was, the name of it. Maybe you remember, but not Waterloo, the one before Waterloo. But anyway, there's a final decisive battle, and they end up defeating Napoleon, and they banish him to a small island in Elba, and they let him be the emperor of the island, which I always think is weird. Like, why would you not put this guy as a prisoner? Why would you let this guy be an emperor? Why would you be so nice?
Because he's too well loved by the French public.
Maybe
he's too well loved, and the previous government that they installed was the monarchy, which that's the point of the entire revolution. They got rid of the monarchy, and then the monarchy was put back in power.
Yeah.
So the people didn't like that, and if they found out that Napoleon was killed by the occupying forces, he's going to be seen as a martyr, and it's going to be Revolution 2.0
Yep.
or more.
Yep.
Like it's going to look like the revolutions of 1848.
Yep.
We had revolutions all across Europe. Now imagine that, except during the Napoleonic age.
I think
It'd
that's
be
a
terrifying.
That's a good reason. But you know, the way that they did do it was they put him on Elba, and then I think it's a year later he comes back to France.
Yeah, he decided to gauge the situation in France, and when the monarchy took over, they just did very similar to what before the revolution happened.
And
Very
the
similar.
people had outgrown. They had matured to a point where there was no going back. You can't go
Yeah,
once
they
you have
tasted
your
that
freedom.
freedom.
They tasted the freedom. They had this Napoleonic code, which treated them as autonomous individuals, and then you had a French system come back where these aristocrats, which don't really care about them, which basically use them for their own wealth. And the people didn't like this.
They got addicted to freedom.
So they were ready to be liberated once again. And once they heard that Napoleon had landed, outside of whatever the coast of France, the southern coast of France, they rallied around him. And damn it, Napoleon was able to come back from the dead, as it were, to rally the troops. And he had a sizable army. He went around, and the first two battles that he went straight to Belgium, because this was the Seventh Coalition. It was very quick. They were like, "Oh, Napoleon's back. Got to mobilize our troops." And so they met. And the first two battles, he was like in Belgium or something. He actually won. But then Napoleon was going for a decisive victory, and that's where he messed up. And he went after this coalition where it was Prussian. What was it?
It was the Prussians.
Austrian.
No, it was the
English.
Prussians and the English.
Yeah, Prussians and the English, and
the English is Nelson.
Yeah, well, Nelson was dead by this
No,
point.
I know. I'm just messing with you.
Oh, you mean like, yeah. But there was another famous English general that was at this battle. Do you remember his name? I think we should remember his name.
I know we
English
should.
Fans might be.
Yeah, they're not going to be happy with us for some reason. I can't. It's not Admiral Nelson. It's
You know who I'm talking about, right?
I know who you're talking about, but yeah, at the Battle of Waterloo, it was pretty hilarious about Napoleon. Well, no, how do I put this? They tried to get rid of he sent a corps to go and deal with the Prussians, but they only were dealing with a small portion of the army. The main army was already heading to Napoleon. And when Napoleon found this out, man, he went into a rage when he found out of what happened.
Yeah, it's just his
Oh, Wellington.
Wellington.
Thank you. I was about.
Beef Wellington.
I was being reminded of beef Wellington.
Yeah,
I'm getting hungry.
Wellington was a badass, and Napoleon just didn't have his officers weren't as competent. They weren't as confident in him. Once things started getting shaky, they started to abandon him, and his armies were routing. They didn't have the discipline that they had.
It was poor, and also
younger.
they were
as
stationed
experienced.
weird.
Yeah.
Like the British, and to a lesser extent the Prussians, they were actually on hilltops. Which usually, if I'm going to make that instant joke you're going to see in the episode 3 of Star Wars, it's over Anakin, I have the high ground.
Yeah.
That's the most common military trope you're ever going to find in military history. Whoever has the high ground has the best chance of winning.
Well, except for Austerlitz, where Napoleon actually turned that on its head.
That's true.
But yeah, it's 9 times out of 10. If you're attacking the high ground,
you're gone.
You're not going to make it. Napoleon didn't even attack the high ground in Austerlitz. He just brought them down from the high ground. But yeah, so he loses this battle, and they make him sign a treaty. They banish him to an island, and he dies 5 years later.
St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic.
Middle of nowhere.
Dies in 1820. Dies in 1827, I believe.
Yeah, and so you close the book on a great individual, and I mean great on the impact he had. And it was.
He creates after his passing, Europe creates the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and created a whole new system that would last for about 100 years. And then obviously it ended with World War I.
So, that's the way he went out. He went out with a bang. And so I think you see a lot of parallels from Napoleon to history and to the future. Because obviously, like we talked about, there's a lot of echoes into the 1940s with the Nazis and the way they tried to conquer and the way that they attacked Russia, the way that the whole Europe sort of united against them in a lot of ways. but also in the past, because Napoleon is constantly put up there with Julius Caesar and constantly associated because he was of Corsican descent. He was a Roman. And Napoleon always has, if you read his the first primary accounts of what he says, he always equated himself to
He did.
Julius Caesar.
He liked making him.
Romans.
He liked fashioning himself after Caesar, and to a lesser extent Alexander.
That's why he became an emperor. He liked that system. He saw the throwback to that system as something to be desired. And if you look at the great general, the general statesman, that sort of conquers and makes a civilization in his image, you don't see that. And going back into the Roman emperors, maybe Charlemagne. Well, not even Charlemagne wasn't a general, like in a Napoleon sense. The closest you can get to is Caesar, and maybe Augustus.
What about
maybe,
Octavian?
Trajan.
Octavian, sort of.
Yeah, Augustus. And so you have, Roman emperors that were really military generals conquering all these lands and doing so in such a way that having such a high victory rate that sort of it makes them powerful beyond comparison. And so there's a lot of parallels to to classical emperors from Napoleon, and then you have the parallels to the future, which we already talked about. So what are some other takeaways from Napoleon's life that you see, Nick? Like, what should people out there know about Napoleon that could be translated into useful life lessons? Is there anything there? Maybe pride, maybe...
I would say the thing about pride is it's one of those that it can be used well. If it can be used well, but in general, if you don't know how to use it, it's more of a detriment. Basically, try to imagine a double-edged sword, except it's more likely to go after you than help you, unless you have the means to do it. In terms of strategy, it was good to be bold. It was good to think outside the box, but at the same time, he had to be cautious. And he was like that in the beginning. He always been cautious for battles that he knew he could win. Other than that, I would say he had to stop being crass. He had to play the Europeans. Yeah. He needed to play like the Europeans, or try to act more European monarch-like than the rest of the European monarchs, to be seen as semi-equal, or at least tolerable.
Yeah.
Now, I think he did well on trying to get the people on his side, but he tried to create a militaristic society too quickly, and he tried to seize power too quickly, and he tried changing the entire balance of Europe, which obviously the main powers did not like that. They loved the way it was before.
Yes,
so that was a bad idea.
Trying to conquer Europe really doesn't go well for anybody.
Honestly,
maybe
no.
The Huns, or what was
no,
it,
not
Mongols?
even the Huns. The Mongols, they're a weird case.
Yeah, but it's not really.
Honestly, the Romans had the best shot.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Romans maybe the Byzantines.
Yeah.
They had the best shot.
Conquered even for the Romans. Eventually, that's what kind of
they expanded too much, which was a big problem of Napoleon.
The east and the north. So
he expanded too much.
I would agree. I would say that when it comes to conquering Europe, Romans did it actually, but the Rhine is pretty much the limit. So it's not even Russia, it's not even Prussia, it's not even Germany.
Yeah, it's the Rhine and the Danube.
They couldn't even do that, and it was they had England up to a certain point, but so outside of the Romans in the modern era, conquering Europe is pretty much a disaster. But so what I would say two things, when it comes to looking at Napoleon's life that are important for someone to sort of recognize.
Before you go on, I would say it's good to be diplomatic all the way.
Yeah.
It's good to be diplomatic. I understand that there are definitely times where you can't be diplomatic, and sometimes you have to take the strong arm approach, but it's a matter of know when to be crass and know when to be diplomatic.
Right. Yeah, most definitely. So diplomacy
is
should
key.
be looked to first. You can't always solve the problems with the sword. And I think that's something that America tries to do today, and that's that's bad.
Which is weird, because we used to be more diplomatic in the past.
And I understand the temptation. There's a temptation there. Humans have been struggling with that problem forever. But it takes a lot of virtue to realize that, you know, if this can be solved in a peaceable way, if this can be solved in a win-win way, that's the best option versus everything's mine, I'm going to take it. Might makes right. In every case that you look at, it works in the beginning, and then it ends up turning out very terribly in the end. There's very few exceptions. But
Yeah, if you're
going to live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword.
If you're going to grow or expand, whether it's military, business, politics, whatever, don't be too quick about it. Don't eat. Well, how do I put this? Take it a bite at a time. Don't try to swallow the entire thing.
Yeah.
That's impossible. Don't do that. That's going to be bad for you.
Yeah, and so in modern age, I don't even think taking a bite out of anything is the way to go about it anymore. You got to make negotiations. But I just want to go ahead and get into the next part.
Yeah.
And so there's two things that I want to say, and the first one's going to tie into the second. But when it comes to Napoleon, because I think that he is an example, at the end of the day, of a great individual. And I mean great in terms of impact, accomplishing things, of action, of bringing in a sense of order into the world. You can't deny that. And, you know, what separates Napoleon from the average everyday Joe? You know, like Napoleon, if Napoleon had a vision, try to look at it like that. Like, take away the judgment of good and bad for a second and look at it as Napoleon had a vision, and it was a vast vision, a major vision, a huge vision, a world-changing vision. And he was able to accomplish it to a large extent. So how did he do that? You know, obviously Napoleon was able to make decisions quickly. He was able to make really good decisions in terms of bringing him to his goal, you know, because he did things that brought him closer to that. And he was able to execute. He was able to move people in their parts. But the first thing that I would say is that he was a good systematizer. So there was all of these ideas from the Enlightenment. There was all of these military innovations that the thinkers have already thought of. Napoleon wasn't an innovator in the core system. He was just the first to majorly implement it. There was the French military writers had actually already thought about this. They just couldn't implement it under the aristocratic system. The law codes, you know, Napoleon wasn't the legal mind making sure that all this was done, but he was able to recognize that something needs to be done, and he got the people together to get this done. So he was a good systematizer, okay? What's the best way to accomplish something? And then I'm going to be the person that makes sure that it's implemented. Then that is a level of genius.
I would say he's a decent, if not good I would say he's a good administrator.
Yeah, exactly.
A pretty good one.
He's a good administrator, but recognizing what kind of administration, at least when it comes to effectiveness.
How to govern.
Yeah, effectiveness and efficiency. Napoleon was able to recognize those things. And, you know, he was able to sort of create, you know, a civilized system, like a build-up French civilization that ran in a way that really hadn't been done before. So he was a good systematizer. He looked at what worked best, and he incorporated that at a rate that was much faster. You know, he basically threw out tradition. Oh, that's the way we have been doing it for centuries? No. Let's think about this today. How can we do this today? What's going to get us the best results? Doesn't matter how things have been done. And that is part of his genius, to recognize that and to actually do it. But that leads into the second part, is that is effectiveness towards a goal. So I always think about it, like, what if Napoleon had that same energy, that same ambition, that same genius of effectiveness, but his vision was a good one? So, like, instead of trying to bring war to Europe, he was trying to bring peace and prosperity to Europe. You know, like, if he was someone who really did, like Rob said in the beginning, fought for the principles of liberty, and, you know, fought for the principles of virtue even, or for religion, or for some benevolent force, like not just a personal personal power grab. So for an individual, that there can be individuals out there, and there are examples out there, like we talked about with Ashoka, where you have a vision of a society that's run orderly, that's run justly, that's run peaceably, that's run strongly, because there's always going to be enemies out there. You have to be strong, but that does help people realize their maximum potential. That does help a meritocratic society form and to prosper and to thrive. And the world needs a Napoleon that can have the same level of effectiveness, but that can achieve a vision that's on the right side, the true side, the righteous side, and not on a simple power side or a simple arbitrary, ambitious side. And so that's something that I think is important. So if you're going to be a Napoleon for good. And so that would be my message. You know, because that's what the world needs. A lot of times the people who fight for good are not as effective as Napoleon, and the people who fight for bad or who fight for injustice are just as effective as Napoleon. And so I don't think the two have to go hand in hand. I think you can have a strong ruler, a strong, virtuous, wise leader who is a Napoleon, but he's fighting for peace and he's fighting for justice. So that would be my interpretation of it. But other than that, final thoughts, Nick? Is there any last things looking over the life, the rise and the fall of Napoleon, or even the French Revolution, or what happens afterwards? But final thoughts before we wrap up this amazing podcast.
Final thoughts? It'd be that
About his
if you have,
wives.
that would be something to talk about. But rather, you mentioned the Mauryan Empire. You mentioned the Mauryans with Ashoka. That's going to be about ancient antiquity. That's also going to involve talks involving Alexander the Great, which we do have videos of those. So if you haven't seen those, please
Ashoka
do.
and Alexander. Yeah, that's right.
By all means, do it. And you mentioned Julius Caesar as well. We'll be talking about Julius Caesar in the near future. So
hit that subscribe
yeah,
button.
let's see if we can cross that Rubicon.
Let's cross that Rubicon into. We have a goal: 25 subscribers. 25 subscribers.
No, let's be more let's be
go.
more in.
You know what? That's
25
right.
plus 5. No, I'm just
Let's be
No,
Napoleonic about
yeah, let's
this.
go-
We want
let's go through-
100 subscribers. So if
I
you're out
wanna
there
say
and you're
1,000.
watching this,
I wanna say
just out
1,000.
of the sheer kindness of your heart, even if you're never gonna watch a video again.
It's
hit
okay
that
if
damn
it's
subscribe
okay if you can get like 1,000 people and just get them to all like and subscribe.
Yeah.
That's
So
perfectly fine.
If you're a bot, talk to the other bots and get a system going where you get. If you're,
Hey, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll take it. Just to get these algorithms going. But the last thing that I would say is that he did set the dominoes to fall for a republic in Europe. And it's crazy to me to think back.
Or at least
back
he
in the
tried
day-
to do it, but it wouldn't be until another 100 years.
It wasn't his. It was a consequence of his system. The Napoleonic Code being adopted, the serfs being abolished in Prussia, the ending the Holy Roman Empire, and showing Europe that there was a different way to live, and having the French constantly. And once the French were freed, they kept having these cycles, these empire cycles, these monarchy cycles, but they were still a bastion of an example of what it looks like to be free. And ever since then, the dominoes start to fall, and because of the American example, because of the French example, you start to see Europe become more and more democratic, more and more republic, to where you have today, to where pretty much every country in Europe has a large republican system, right?
Very
some of them
more
have their kings,
parliamentary, but
parliamentary, but that's still a representation.
it's a
system.
Republican type of
It's not
system.
an absolutist system like you had with France, basically.
Right, there's
And-
almost no monarchies left, at least in Europe.
Well, if you have them, they're figureheads.
Yeah, they're either figureheads, no real absolutist or one that even has any type of influence besides the Queen of England and maybe the rulers in Denmark, Norway, places, or Spain. They're really the only ones left. Not much else beyond that.
Yeah, and so that's a legacy that I think we can attribute to Napoleon, at least indirectly. That sort of his.
Or at least he's the foundation for it.
Yeah, exactly. So with that being said, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Nick, for helping us uncover all of this. And like the next podcast that what you guys have to look forward to is the Julius Caesar podcast. I think we were going to do another entertainment podcast. So we did a podcast on Star Wars. Ooh. And that was really cool. And I think we're going to do another one. I think you and Deshaun wanted to do something on anime. I threw out the idea of maybe a Dragon Ball Z podcast. And we're definitely going to do a lot of historians. So if you have any ideas about podcasts you want us to do, go ahead and comment those in. Because me and Nick are historians. We love history. We find it fascinating.
Yep. We're nerds.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but we just love history. And we love talking about it. And we love looking at it to get lessons from it. Because I think that's why history should be there. It's not just there to say, oh, this happened, this happened, this happened. No, let's use history so that we can correct the future, at least in our lives. Right. So, in our lifetime. So, with that being said, that's it. Stay tuned.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. look like. Let's see how that's been like what? Oh wow, about 2 hours.
Oh man. Oh, that's good. That's good.
Oh man, that's what happens when all.
Man, Rob left with 20 minutes.
Yeah, well, he followed what he said.
Yeah.
But man, dude, if you ever get the chance to read about his love life, holy crap! From what I